In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. I must first of all apologize to you for appearing in my shirt sleeves, merely. It is very hot where I live. I found in preparing a few notes for what I was going to say today far more material than I thought I would. So it may very well be that this may go into 2 sessions. If you don't like my rambling thoughts, it doesn't surprise me, but understand that is what my thoughts are like. So let's think about the human theories of the interpretation of Genesis. Let's think about the higher criticism. First of all social engineering is always begun by verbal engineering. So also is religious engineering. We call it the higher criticism. So if you don't believe in it, you must be low. So let's think about this higher stuff. Theories about the Bible, which have their origin in the so-called reason of unregenerate men, or even sincere Christians who have been trained to think as if they were pagans, are generally mistaken. That's kind of a no-brainer, but that's not the worst that can be said of them. They do not merely miss the mark, if the mark is arriving at the truth. They shoot all the innocent bystanders who are attending the shooting demonstration. They cause untold damage in the kingdom of God. It is not that these folk merely doubt. They purposely eliminate even the possibility of the deity as he has revealed himself from consideration or even discussion. So at the beginning of their argument, they eliminate the possibility of the ontological Trinity and never come back to consider, well, what if God is as he revealed himself? Not only are we going to not assume that, we are going to make sure that in any public discussion that possibility is eliminated. And then they presume to pontificate on the obvious answers they have found. It is easy to have the answer if you don't allow questions. And this has been the continuous history of liberal religious scholarship, which is really pseudo-scholarship. And if you don't believe that, look at the history of institutions. Look at the history of, say, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky now, as they are moving toward a far from biblical position. Look at the history of Methodist schools, and I will not even mention Anglican schools. It's been so long since there was any Orthodox Christianity taught in any of those. So, let's look at the underlying dogma that all of these theories have in common. There is the great whore of Babylon, if you will, and from that, look at all of her illegitimate children. The dogma is that Genesis, and all of the theories are variations on this theme. Genesis is a collection of stories without much careful editing from various sources, whether they be oral or written, representing various forms of the same events or thoughts on the same issues. Essentially, Genesis is a book of folklore. It, at best, could be considered an epic poem, and they will compare it to Beowulf and all those epic poems. I'll get into the reasons why that is quite absurd. The Bible, then, according to this general principle, is not in any meaningful way inspired, though, at least early on, there was lip service to inspiration. And I believe it was the last, perhaps the one before the last video where I discussed the silly things that the unbelievers will get us to say by pushing us in a corner when they get us to allow for the fact that their position is the neutral position. And one of those silly ideas was something that my roommate in college said. He was a religion major and intended to be a United Methodist minister, and we were talking about our respective views of inspiration one day, and he said, "Well, I believe that it is the imperfect words revealing the perfect word." So somewhere down there, apparently from what he was saying, was the message that God intended if you could scrape through all the muck in the text to get to it. So if you accept this whole idea, you have to come to the conclusion that ultimately you go down the road and be as consistent with it as you can, and you come to the conclusion that it really, if it is inspired in some abstract theoretical sense, it doesn't really mean much in the here and now. In fact, it is even less inspired than these folks' interpretation, which that word is a euphemism for rewriting of it. After all, they are scholars and they're being scientific, right? It is not that they merely doubt. It is that they must push their doubt. And you will never find, unfortunately, you'll find all too many complacent Orthodox Christians that are willing to live and let live. You will not find a liberal religious scholar who will live and let live. They are adamant. They will run their colleagues off of faculties. They will do whatever violence they must do to eliminate anyone who takes a position opposite their interpretation. They literally put themselves on a magisterial throne. Very sad indeed. So, what are the problems with this dogma? Well, there are several. Let's go over a few. Number one, it discounts the possibility of inspiration. It is not a fair argument, and we've gone over that pretty thoroughly already. Number two, it does not take into account genre, which is one of the most, which is definitely an aspect of inspiration. Now, I referred earlier to the folk that will compare Genesis to Beowulf and The Lord of the Rings and other things like that. And I enjoy Beowulf, and I certainly enjoy The Lord of the Rings. I've read it about 6 times, maybe 7, at least, yeah, 6 to 8, somewhere in there. But I do not consider them to be inspired. I do not consider them to contain the stuff of which my whole worldview is to be derived. And one of the dishonest things about this is that Beowulf is sure enough an epic poem. Genesis is not written as poetry. It is not written in that form. It is written in very straightforward historical prose. There's no poetic aspect of it at all. It is just straightforward. This. In fact, it is surprisingly direct and uncomplicated in the way that it reveals history. It also is written in the form that much of Near Eastern and Middle Eastern history is written. So, whoever wrote it believed that they were writing history. So, I can respect the honest person that says, I just don't believe that that is true. I can do nothing but disdain the person that in the name of scholarship is either that ignorant of the genre of which the book of Genesis is a part, or that dishonest, comparing two things which are so manifestly different, fundamentally. Number 3, this dogma posits the idea that Moses could not have had access to much of the material in the book. This is certainly not true at all, particularly if you consider the histories in the book to be true. First of all, if he was informed by an oral tradition, and I believe he was, I used to hold to the view that perhaps he had some antediluvian documents or something. I don't at this point. And one of the main reasons is the age in which he lived was an age of extreme longevity of life. We make monuments to remember past events that are beyond our lifetime and perhaps beyond our grandparents', great-grandparents' lifetime. We preserve knowledge through monuments and often written records. However, when you had people living as long as the antediluvians and the patriarchs lived, that was not such a big deal, because you had many people who were first-hand witnesses or maybe one generation removed from the actual events. So it was less important in that time. Now let's think about this. Adam lived 930 years. He had many sons and daughters. We know of some, probably not all. And if you go down several generations, you come to Methuselah, who lived 969 years. He was a contemporary of Adam. Methuselah lived contemporaneously with Adam for 243 years. He probably knew Adam. Adam was, of course, as all of us, his direct ancestor, and people in the antediluvian world, it is thought, had not fanned out quite so greatly into all the earth, perhaps as they did later. It stands to reason that he would have been able to hear, probably firsthand, what God had related to Adam about his creation. Methuselah was the grandfather of a fellow by the name of Noah. He did not die until the year that the flood came. So Noah knew Methuselah. He no doubt heard the histories related by Methuselah, which were probably from Adam. And then Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Now Shem was probably known to Abraham and possibly to Isaac. Abraham was 150 years a contemporary of Shem. So, saying that, it is quite possible that they knew each other. Certainly, they probably had mutual acquaintances at least. So we have Abraham, we've come to the generation of the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, Joseph knew his own father. And Levi knew his own brother, Joseph. And Amram knew Levi, who was his great-grandfather. And Amram was the father of Moses. So we don't see generations and generations and generations and multiple scores of generations in which these things could become muddled. We only have about 6 people that would be crucial to have been in contact. Also, if you look at internal evidence in the book of Moses, or in the book of Genesis, you find, place names that someone who was acquainted with the Egyptian kingdom of the time would have had to have known. And only, perhaps, someone like that. So it makes total sense that Moses is the author. One of the just totally stupid arguments that Moses could not have written it is that it represents thought so advanced that Moses couldn't have possibly come up with that. Well, first of all, here's the real answer. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts, saith the Lord. But beyond that, there is no reason to believe that. We do have, for example, the name that Abraham gave God, the everlasting God. We find that written in at least one inscription in a mine in Sinai in Hebrew, but with Paleo-Semitic characters. That was probably, definitely, from the time before the Exodus. So, and that leads me to another reason to reject this dogma, and that is that it ignores the tremendous amount of linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence that are to the contrary. Finally, this ridiculous dogma denies the essential unity of the book, which is quite obvious. The overall theme and movement of the book. It is written in a form very similar to other Near Eastern history, going from things very general to things very specific. And that is the assumption when you read that genre of history. It is not one that many of these scholars, these Orientalists, don't apply, and they read it in a Western way. To be sure, the content, though, is very different. The overall theme of the book, which and the direction in which it goes, which I'm going to assert right now, is one of God's providence and engagement with His creation even after the fall, and His choosing. The whole idea of choosing is through it, front to back. There is actually a lot of unity in the book, and most of the discontinuity can be attributed to an appropriate use of different words, different style. What author doesn't use different styles in the same work, or different choices of words? And those can be explained through the use of pretty much good common horse sense. So, I hope that I will get another video up, possibly today, maybe by next week. I will try very hard to get the next one, which will focus somewhat on the documentary hypothesis, another man-made idea that had its origin anywhere but in sound thought. Until then, may the Lord bless you.